Scholars and historians have been challenged trying to find which pharaoh or pharaohs subjected the Israelites into bondage. For that matter, which pharaoh promoted Joseph to the highest rank in Egypt. Our initial question is, should we even try to uncover this mystery altogether? From a scholastic point of view, the answer is obvious, of course. It can only help verify the Bible, the Torah. Does it violate Torah's ethics in any way? After all, Moses himself did not identify Pharaoh, and neither did Ezra. So why should we? We should ask, why then did Moses not identify the Pharaoh? There are several reasons we could give. He had gratitude toward Pharaoh's house for raising him and taking him in as his own child. Also, he did not want to glorify or demean any further any pharaoh that was wrong to subjugate the Israelites. Perhaps he'd just be erased to the vestiges of history. More practically, it is wholly possible that Pharaoh did not go by a name altogether. They were just simply called Pharaoh. Historians attribute names to Pharaoh based on tombs and hieroglyphics. However, it is possible that contemporaries just knew them as Pharaoh. I'll venture to move forward and identify these pharaohs from the Bible. Otherwise, this video will be quite short. The most popular view among Jews, Christians, and Coptic scholars is that Pharaoh that Moses brought to his knees and plagued 10 times was Ramses II. Now, Ramses only fits with the most precursory investigation because the Torah says they built the cities of Pithom and Ramses. His father is said to have died shortly before the enslavement. A new king arose in Egypt. In history, Ramses II's father, Seti, died, giving way to Ramses II's great rule. However, that is based on scant evidence and is short-sighted, as following the age-old view that the Israelites crossed the Red Sea at the Gulf of Suez, or that Mount Sinai is in the Sinai Desert. We need more evidence and to more carefully read the Torah's clues. When investigating history to determine the correct pharaoh, historians look at three major factors. First, the timeline is indicated in the Torah. What period of history does the Torah say the events occurred? Second, the timeline is indicated by Egyptian history. Who was Pharaoh and when? When those are matched up, we can look at the third, the factual evidence that would corroborate the facts in the Torah actually occurring in Egypt. Evidence of a new king shortly before the Exodus. Evidence of the plagues when horses and chariots were used in the Egyptian army. First, we look at the Torah's timeline. The year from King Solomon to the Exodus we know is 480 years. Kings 1, chapter 6, verse 1. We also have to look at the years from the descent into Egypt back to the Great Flood. The years from the Exodus to the invasion of the kingdom of Judea by Pharaoh Necho. Finally, the years from the Exodus all the way to the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 Common Era. Second, we look at the Egyptian timeline. At first glance, Ramses is clearly way too late in history. Scholars want to reconcile the Egyptian history with the Torah timeline have to do one of two things. Either ignore the Egyptian timeline or state that the biblical one is inaccurate. Or could it be that Pharaoh of the Exodus was a different Pharaoh? When looking at the third factor, factual evidence, Ramses clearly does not fit in any way. He shows no evidence of a downfall or destruction, and he also gave way to his child. Lining up two timelines, we fall to Pharaoh Harimhab, who does not fit either. When we take a closer look at the timelines and corroborating evidence, we look at the biblical timeline and we know the years from the Exodus to King Solomon, as we stated. However, we do not necessarily know the years from King Solomon to today, nor do we know the years from the Exodus and when it commenced. First, many scholars add about 167 years of missing timeline between the two Batei Migdash, the two temple periods. Without going on a tangent, there seems to be obvious years missing that are unaccounted for in the Persian historical evidence, including the obvious. How does Esther's son Darius allow the temple to be rebuilt if he was not even born at the time of the Purim episode, and the Purim episode took place at the final years of the 70-year exile? Also, he was supposedly Darius II. When was Darius I? Second, while the Torah's timeline is specific, after that we rely on the Talmudic scholars who dated backwards, counting from one Kohen Gadol to the next, and relying on certain benchmarks of Greek and Roman history. The timeline can be off by a few decades or even a few centuries. Accordingly, from 70, the date of the destruction of the end of the First Roman-Judean War, to the destruction of the First Temple, was closer to 650 years, rather than 488 years. Many scholars believed that the Second Temple period was more than 585 years, and not the mere 420 years as brought down by the Talmud. Similarly, the 70-year exile was not merely 70 years. The 70-year period was a specific drought in Jewish sovereignty. The total years between the exile and the building of the Second Temple could be a couple of centuries long. That would push the Exodus to 1312 BCE to 1480 BCE, or even to 1530 BCE based on these calculations. Further, Talmudic scholars believe the time in Egypt was actually only 210 years from the time when Yaakov, descended to Egypt. They have calculation for the 430 years mentioned in the Bible, saying commenced actually when Abraham entered Canaan and had the covenant of the parts, the Bris Bein Absarim. However, if the 430 years are taken literally, and for the commencement of bondage, that means that the death of Joseph and the commencement of bondage was not 1455 BCE, but closer to 1900 BCE. The year from the Great Flood to the death of Joseph are more specific in the Torah, and that is 655 years. Thus, the years from King Solomon to the Great Flood are 1565 years. That puts the Great Flood at the year 2568 BCE. Just to put things in perspective, the Great Flood of China under Emperor Yao is said to be around 2300 BCE. The Epic of Gilgamesh and the Babylonian version was written in 2000 BCE, so probably dating back to also 2200 or 2300 BCE. Since the Egyptians were descendants of Ham, Noah's son, the Egyptian Empire could not have started earlier than this date. Yet the Old Kingdom is said to be dated back to 2649. That's 919 years not accounted for. Perhaps we can look at the Egyptian dating system to see if there are any flaws. After all, we only commenced really learning about the ancient Egyptian history and their calendar system in the 1800s. Egyptians kept an uncorrected lunar calendar, meaning they did not add a month to keep the months in line with the solar year. When counting from pharaohs, years overlapped, just as they did for the kings in the Bible. A king of one day before the new year was considered to have already gone through 1 year. So 1 year that saw 2 pharaohs rise could be counted as 2 years. Further, scholars state that the years cited in Egyptian history between events are not necessarily solar years, so Egyptian history is shorter than thought. Finally, there are 2 types of pharaohs in Egypt. There was the all-powerful pharaoh of the entire country. Then there was also the local nomarch. Historians do not know if the list of pharaohs they compiled is consecutive or concurrent, meaning, is it consecutive, meaning year after year after year, or actually some pharaohs ruled concurrently as either co-regents or different parts of the country. Finally, we examine the Torah. The main facts we seek to be recorded in history are the major occurrences or episodes that are cited that happened in the Torah. The Great Flood. The Great Flood is corroborated by Chinese and Babylonian history. Both put the Exodus between 1455 and 1215 BCE. Practically, the earliest date it could have been was 1305 BCE, like we said before, going all the way back to 1455 BCE. There was a rise of a great co-regent to Pharaoh who brought prosperity to Egypt. That is Joseph. There is also the combining of the lower and upper Egypt of time. It is important to know that Egypt was not always one large country, like it was during the Exodus. There were 2 kingdoms. There was Lower Egypt, north, near the Nile, and Upper Egypt, south, on higher ground. Think of how New York developed. First there was New Amsterdam, later to be termed New York City, then the entire state became settled. There was Egypt District and the city of Egypt in Lower Egypt. That is what the Bible refers to as Egypt. When the Bible says land of Egypt, that means the entire country, lower and upper. In Genesis, only Egypt is mentioned. After the 7 years of famine and Joseph buys up the property and enslaves all the people in exchange for their food purchase, the Torah talks about the land of Egypt. This must have occurred between 1515 BCE and 1735 BCE. Surprise! The second intermediate period and the new kingdom both commenced during this timeline. We can safely presume now that prior to that, Egypt was just a small city-state in Lower Egypt. Joseph combined them during the period exactly as the Bible says. An enslaved people is hard to decipher, and Egyptian history is fraught with enslaved foreigners. However, there is evidence of Egypt being xenophobic, just as the Torah says the Egyptians were xenophobic toward the Hebrews, the Semites. What about evidence of the 10 plagues in Egypt? Or a period of annihilation, as the Exodus would have also created the destruction of Egypt so bad that there would be evidence in Egyptian history of a period of collapse. Finally, anyone called Moses? Look at the verses of the Torah. A new king of Egypt rose. This refers to the local nomarch, not Pharaoh. King in Egypt in the Bible is a nomarch. Pharaoh in the Bible is Pharaoh. Taxes and the building of Ramses. The city could have been renamed much later. The Torah constantly uses names that were used when the Torah was actually given and not when the events actually occurred. See, for example, Luz and Bethel and Kadesh. All the people that Moses worried about died. This seems to be the Pharaoh that wanted Moses' head, or possibly a co-regent or nomarch. The name Moshe in Moshe is because he was drawn from the water. However, the name Mose and Moshe actually means born from or drawn from. So very possibly Moshe means drawn from the water. Many pharaohs had the name Mose as part of their name. Thutmose is an example. Remember his name because he is our likely candidate for the pharaoh we seek. As for the 10 plagues, there is evidence that certain mummified pharaohs showed evidence of boils on their skins and lice infestation. There are stories of great locust gatherings and lengthy days of darkness. Egyptian history would not talk about the 10 plagues because it is not the best look for Egypt, and history is written always by the perspective of the author. There would be evidence, perhaps, of them in mummified remains or in archaeology, like we talked about. Ramses II, his history does not fit, 1279 to 1213 BCE. He is too late in history. However, the fact that he existed while the Israelites were actually in the desert, where they received the Torah, makes perfect sense of why the Torah calls the cities Ramses. There is archaeological evidence that Pitom and Ramses, were built upon an older city, and that was Avaris. Pitom means storage in ancient Egypt, and it must have been a store city on the frontier. Avaris was located on the eastern frontier, exactly where Goshen was. The tax levied against the Hebrews would pay for the building of the city that was to be Avaris, and then later rebuilt, named Ramses. Archaeologists have discovered that Avaris was built with major silos. These are also indicative of the great silos Yosef had built and filled with grain during the 7 years of plenty. What about Thutmose II? The timeline of a new pharaoh fits very well, and also his facts and history. Josephus talks about Pharaoh being Senwosret of the Middle Kingdom because he was in the mid-1800s BCE, and that fits to the start of the bondage. The name Mitzrayim in Hebrew actually comes from the Egyptian of Misran, which means the two Misras. There was a lower Misra and an upper Misra, like we talked before, that combined to be Mitzrayim. During many dynasties in Egypt, including the Middle Kingdom and New Kingdom, there were many co-regents and also nomarchs. There were two pharaohs, so to speak, or more specifically, two rulers in Egypt. There was an Egypt district ruler, and then there was the global ruler of Pharaoh. One the king of Egypt, the other one the pharaoh. This corroborates what the Torah was saying. This information helps us reconcile the timeline in Egypt. We notice that the first era of Egyptian history all calls the pharaohs king. It is possible that these kings of Egypt actually coincided with later pharaohs that they served with. They were the king, as the Bible called them, while the pharaoh was the ultimate ruler, as the Bible also called them. Therefore, Egyptian history is not consecutive, but it's actually concurrent, and not nearly as long as we thought of. When looking for Yosef, we have to look carefully at the verses in the Torah. He was a commoner who became a royal. Perhaps he was a co-regent or nomarch. He was like a vizier. During this time on the throne, he made Egypt prosper. There's evidence of famines in quite a few periods of Egyptian history. Genesis calls Pharaoh the king of Egypt because that was all he was. He was king of the local city Egypt near Goshen. Later, he is Pharaoh of the land of Egypt, and there is the king of Egypt, who was a local nomarch. Finally, at the end of the bondage, during the plagues, Pharaoh again becomes Pharaoh, king of Egypt, indicating a time when he kicked out all the local nomarchs and ruled all the land himself. It also indicates that he moved his kingdom from Thebes of Upper Egypt down back to closer to Goshen in Lower Egypt. A new king arose that did not know Yosef. His sons did not inherit his throne. They did not know Yosef. He was erased from history, and therefore his name would not be found. The Santorini volcano on an island of the Mediterranean appears to prove that the 10 plagues were not caused by God. However, believers can be assured all natural occurrences also occur by God's hand. Further, the volcano is in the middle of the Mediterranean and close to Egypt. It would cause the 10 plagues all over southern Europe and northern Africa, yet only Egypt was hit by the plagues, and not even the entire country. Goshen was spared. Further, the Judean sages taught that when it says God hardened Pharaoh's heart, it means he sought excuses for the plagues. A coincidental volcano made Pharaoh think that the Lord of the Hebrews was not behind the plagues. Timing of the volcano in the mid-17th century BCE fits perfectly in the downfall of the 12th dynasty of Egypt. It precedes the Hyksos invasion into Lower Egypt by only a few decades. The downfall of Egypt made it ripe for the Hyksos to invade. The Hyksos invasion was at the start of the 13th and 14th dynasties in Egypt. The 13th and 14th dynasties moved into the Second Intermediate Period, a dark age for Egypt. However, these years could have easily overlapped with the Exodus. As we mentioned before, the Egyptian timeline is concurrent, not consecutive. This period was preceded by the 12th dynasty, a period of great wealth and expansion of Egypt that ended quite suddenly and mysteriously. This also fits with the start of the New Kingdom. They may have overlapped. The main seat of the pharaoh was moved to Thebes in Upper Egypt. However, the Torah tells us how Moses and Aaron talked to Pharaoh near Goshen in Lower Egypt. The pharaoh of this dynasty, Pharaoh Amenemhat I, moved the capital from Thebes, Upper Egypt, to Itzjui, which is thought to be a suburb of Cairo in Lower Egypt. Thus, the king of Egypt would sit next to Pharaoh. This indicates he moved his seat to be closer to Goshen, dealing with Moses and the Hebrew problem. When Moses returns, he first talks to the king of Egypt. Then he addresses Pharaoh right away. These Pharaoh and the people already know what occurred. They must have been right near Goshen. The 10th plague killed Pharaoh's son, and presumably his heir. The pharaohs in the late 12th dynasty did not give their throne to the sons. Specifically, the first pharaoh of the 13th dynasty were brothers and they were co-regents, and they took the throne in turn. Further, Thutmose III of the 18th dynasty did not give over to his heir either, but to a regent. In fact, his first son actually predeceased him. Another possibility is Pharaoh Akhenaten, the 10th ruler of the 18th dynasty in the year 1351 to 1334, 480 years prior to the year of 970, which is the year that King Solomon, Shlomo Melech, taken king. Only being 100 years off in Egyptian history is actually very close. Prior to the reign, Egypt built itself up again and expanded its territory and might from its fall during the Second Intermediate Period. There were also slaves in northern territory near Goshen. During his 17-year reign, Pharaoh Akhenaten threw off the idea of polytheism and instead went with monotheism, to serve only the god Aten, something Pharaoh would have done after being defeated by the god of the Hebrews at the Red Sea. He is also a pharaoh that was erased from much of Egyptian history and only discovered later when his temple of Aten was discovered. The later pharaohs did not succeed him, and they worked on discrediting him and calling him mad and a heretic. This treatment corroborates that his reign was a significant failure, possibly because of his allowing a foreign god to defeat him and destroy Egypt and lose all the slaves on the lower land. There is also evidence that he was co-regent with his father for several years. The later years of his reign were not recorded. He also was not succeeded by a son, but by his son-in-law. Then after the rest of the 18th dynasty pharaohs were not related at all but established a new line. This is evidence of the great upheaval during his reign. 7 centuries later, Becheneref, known as Sais, was pharaoh. He could have been the pharaoh So, as mentioned in Kings 2:17, verse 4. Pharaoh Necho, who ruled 610 to 595 BCE, he said to the Torah to have killed King Yoshia and Megiddo in Kings 2:23, verse 29. Their pharaoh was called Necho. Pharaoh Necho ruled from Sais, so it could be why Pharaoh was called Sais earlier. Looking back to Thutmose II, though, he fits best. He ruled for 20 years from 1492 to 1472 BCE. He had a lot of history erased also. He seemed to have put Egypt in ruins, and he was not succeeded by his eldest son, who had predeceased him. He was succeeded by a son from his second wife. He actually was succeeded by his wife as co-regent first. All this indicates a pharaoh struck by plagues and controversy, and who lost his son to the plague of the death of the firstborn. He may have continued to rule after the Exodus, and it was 1492 when all those who wanted Moses dead, Thutmose I, died. We don't know exactly which pharaoh was the pharaoh of the enslavement or the one that suffered the Exodus. However, our careful reading of the Torah and looking at the evidence has certainly pointed us in the right direction.